December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was still burning when Admiral Chester W. Nimitz received the order that would redefine the Pacific War. Battleships lay broken in the mud, thousands of sailors were dead, and the United States had lost much of the fleet it had spent decades building. To many officers, the answer seemed obvious. Rebuild the battleships. Prepare for one decisive surface engagement. Restore the Navy's pride exactly as it had existed before the attack. Nimitz saw something entirely different. Hidden beneath the smoke was the only force that had escaped almost untouched: the submarine fleet. At that moment, it consisted of barely 50 modern boats scattered across the Pacific. Few believed those submarines could decide the outcome of a global war. Fewer still believed the men commanding them were capable of changing history. Yet within 4 years, they would sink more Japanese shipping than every other branch of the American military combined. The accepted belief inside the Navy had survived for decades. Submarine captains were expected to be patient, cautious, almost invisible. A successful patrol meant gathering intelligence, avoiding unnecessary risks, and attacking only when conditions were nearly perfect. Careers depended on preserving expensive submarines, not gambling them away. Every officer understood the unwritten rule: return with your boat. Losing it was considered worse than returning with empty torpedo tubes. It created a generation of commanders who valued survival over aggression. Japan believed exactly the same thing. Before the war, the Imperial Navy invested enormous resources into massive battleships like Yamato and Musashi because its leaders remained convinced that history would be decided by one climactic fleet engagement somewhere in the Western Pacific. Merchant shipping existed only to support that final battle. Few Japanese planners imagined cargo ships, oil tankers, and transport vessels becoming the true center of the conflict. It was an assumption that would slowly destroy the empire from within. Nimitz understood logistics better than symbolism. Every shell fired in the Philippines, every aircraft launched over New Guinea, every destroyer escorting a convoy depended on fuel, ammunition, food, steel, and replacement crews, crossing thousands of miles of ocean. Japan possessed factories, soldiers, and experienced admirals, but it possessed almost no natural oil. Most of its petroleum came from territories hundreds of miles away. Every barrel had to travel by sea. Sink enough ships and the entire military machine would begin starving long before its armies admitted defeat. There was only one problem. The submarine force itself was failing. During the first months of the war, patrol after patrol returned with disappointing reports. Captains described perfect firing solutions followed by impossible misses. Torpedoes struck enemy hulls without exploding. Others ran far deeper than their settings indicated. Some circled back toward the submarines that had launched them. Opportunities disappeared while Japanese convoys escaped almost untouched. Official reports blamed the commanders. Perhaps they had misjudged distances. Perhaps they fired too early. Perhaps they lacked courage. Few senior officers wanted to believe that America's most advanced torpedo was fundamentally broken. Nimitz refused to accept easy explanations. He had spent his career around machinery, engineering, and submarines. He understood that experienced officers rarely made identical mistakes over and over again. If dozens of skilled captains reported the same impossible failures, the equipment deserved as much suspicion as the men using it. That willingness to question assumptions separated him from many of his contemporaries. Another weakness also became impossible to ignore. Some submarine commanders simply lacked the temperament for offensive warfare. They followed every regulation, avoided unnecessary danger, and interpreted orders exactly as written. Their patrol reports were technically flawless, but strategically meaningless. Boats returned with full torpedo inventories after spending weeks shadowing enemy convoys without attacking. Every patrol represented thousands of gallons of fuel, months of preparation, and one of the Navy's most valuable weapons. Returning empty-handed became increasingly difficult to justify. Instead of protecting reputations, Nimitz began protecting results. Quietly, almost without public attention, captains who consistently failed to attack were reassigned. Some returned to training commands, others moved behind desks. Officially, they had not failed. Unofficially, their wartime careers at sea were over. Promotion boards noticed. Younger officers noticed even more. The replacements were often men who had not fit comfortably into the Navy's traditional image of command. Some were considered too aggressive. Others questioned accepted doctrine. Several possessed records that suggested independent thinking rather than strict conformity. In peacetime, those qualities could slow promotion. In wartime, they suddenly became priceless. Among the officers beginning to attract attention was Dudley "Mush" Morton. His personality hardly matched the cautious culture that had shaped the submarine force before the war. Morton believed hesitation was more dangerous than boldness. He expected his crew to attack relentlessly whenever an opportunity appeared. Confidence radiated through every decision he made. Some superiors admired him. Others considered him reckless. The debate would not last long. Another name waiting in the wings belonged to Richard O'Kane. Analytical, disciplined, and remarkably calm under pressure, O'Kane approached submarine warfare from almost the opposite direction. Where Morton relied on instinct and aggression, O'Kane combined careful calculations with absolute determination once a target had been selected. Different personalities, the same refusal to let enemy convoys escape. Nimitz was not searching for identical commanders. He was searching for one shared characteristic: initiative, the willingness to make difficult decisions alone, hundreds of miles from headquarters, with no possibility of asking permission. Every submarine captain disappeared beneath the Pacific for weeks at a time. Once submerged, radio silence often became essential. Success depended not on detailed instructions but on judgment. The men who waited for perfect certainty usually found nothing at all. Without announcing it publicly, Chester Nimitz had begun rebuilding more than a fleet. He was rebuilding the culture of American submarine warfare. The transformation would not start with a new weapon or a revolutionary strategy. It would begin with something far more difficult to replace than steel: the right men. January 1942. The Pacific Ocean had become the largest hunting ground in history, yet America's submarines still struggled to draw blood. Patrol reports continued to describe convoys slipping away after torpedoes either failed to explode or passed harmlessly beneath their targets. Inside the Bureau of Ordnance, engineers defended the Mark 14 torpedo with unwavering confidence. According to official testing, the weapon worked exactly as designed. According to the men risking their lives beneath the waves, it did not. The contradiction could no longer be ignored. Every failed attack meant another tanker delivering oil, another freighter carrying ammunition, another transport reinforcing distant Japanese garrisons. The cost of denial was measured not only in missed opportunities but in American lives. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood shared Nimitz's growing frustration. Having commanded submarines himself, he trusted experienced captains more than laboratory reports. When boat after boat returned describing identical failures, Lockwood reached a conclusion that many officials refused to consider. The torpedoes were defective. Proving it, however, required confronting one of the Navy's most powerful bureaucracies. The Bureau of Ordnance insisted that the problem lay with nervous commanders, inaccurate range estimates, or poor firing angles. Admitting a design flaw would expose years of costly mistakes and threaten countless careers in Washington. Nimitz quietly backed Lockwood. Instead of silencing the complaints, he encouraged further investigation. Live fire tests were ordered under realistic combat conditions rather than carefully controlled demonstrations. The results were impossible to dismiss. Torpedoes consistently ran deeper than their settings indicated, passing beneath the hulls they were supposed to destroy. Magnetic exploders detonated prematurely or failed entirely. Even contact pistols, designed to explode on impact, often crumpled without firing the warhead. The Navy's most sophisticated underwater weapon had betrayed the men who depended on it. Correcting those failures transformed the submarine campaign almost overnight. Captains who had begun questioning their own judgment suddenly discovered that their instincts had been right all along. Confidence returned. Every successful explosion reinforced the belief that aggressive tactics could finally deliver results. Boats that had once returned with empty records now came back reporting burning tankers, shattered cargo ships, and desperate rescue operations scattered across the Pacific. But equipment alone did not explain the sudden change. Leadership mattered just as much. Nimitz continued replacing commanders who viewed every patrol primarily as a mission to survive. The new generation accepted survival as desirable, but never as the objective. Their purpose was destruction. Every patrol began with a single question: where could Japan be hurt the most? No officer embodied that philosophy more dramatically than Dudley Mush Morton. After taking command of USS Wahoo from his very first patrol, Morton rejected nearly every assumption that had governed submarine operations before the war. He attacked boldly in daylight. He closed distances many considered dangerously short. Instead of waiting endlessly for the perfect firing solution, he exploited confusion, speed, and surprise. Japanese escorts repeatedly found themselves reacting to attacks they never expected an American submarine captain to attempt. His executive officer, Richard O'Kane, watched every engagement with extraordinary attention. Morton supplied relentless aggression. O'Kane supplied meticulous analysis. Together they formed one of the most effective command teams in submarine history. Every patrol became a classroom where bold ideas were tested against the harsh reality of combat. When something worked, they repeated it. When something failed, they changed immediately. Tradition carried little weight if experience suggested a better answer. Japanese convoy commanders struggled to understand what had changed. For years, submarines had behaved predictably, attacking cautiously before disappearing beneath the surface. Suddenly, they faced opponents willing to penetrate escort screens, launch multiple attacks, and remain in contact for hours. Convoys that once crossed enormous stretches of ocean with relative confidence now sailed under constant psychological pressure. Every horizon concealed potential danger. Every sonar contact forced difficult decisions. Escorts consumed precious fuel chasing submarines that often vanished before striking again from another direction. The cumulative effect reached far beyond individual sinkings. Merchant captains delayed departures while waiting for additional escorts. Convoys slowed their speed to remain organized. Shipping schedules slipped further behind every month. Factories waited longer for raw materials. Frontline commanders requested supplies that never arrived on time. None of those problems appeared catastrophic by themselves. Together, they slowly strangled an empire dependent upon uninterrupted maritime transport. Nimitz recognized something equally important. Success created confidence, and confidence created initiative. Captains returning from victorious patrols shared tactics openly with younger officers preparing for their first combat assignments. Experienced crews explained how to approach convoys at night, exploit silhouettes against moonlit horizons, and evade increasingly aggressive depth charge attacks. Knowledge spread through the force faster than any official training manual could manage. The transformation became visible in patrol statistics. More attacks, more confirmed sinkings. Greater willingness to pursue difficult targets instead of settling for easy opportunities. American submarines remained vastly outnumbered across the Pacific, but they no longer fought as isolated boats following rigid doctrine. They operated as a learning organization whose greatest advantage was adaptability. Japan, by contrast, adapted painfully slowly. Its naval leadership remained obsessed with protecting battleships and preparing for decisive fleet engagements, even as merchant losses climbed month after month. Convoy systems expanded only gradually. Anti-submarine technology improved, but never quickly enough to match the growing effectiveness of American crews. Each improvement arrived after another generation of experienced submarine captains had already developed new methods to overcome it. The officers Nimitz had quietly chosen were no longer merely replacing their predecessors. They were rewriting the rules of submarine warfare itself, and with every convoy that disappeared beneath the Pacific, Japan moved one step closer to a crisis its leaders still refused to recognize. The empire was not running out of ships first, it was running out of time. November 1943. Somewhere in the waters east of Formosa, an American submarine lay motionless beneath the surface, while the sound operator counted propeller beats echoing through the hull. One destroyer, two cargo ships. Then another convoy emerging from the darkness. A year earlier, most submarine commanders would have studied the formation carefully, waited for ideal firing conditions, and accepted that some targets would inevitably escape. The new generation thought differently. Every convoy represented another opportunity to cut the arteries feeding the Japanese empire. Waiting for perfection often meant losing everything. By late 1943, the transformation Nimitz had begun was impossible to deny. The officers once viewed as too aggressive had become the Navy's most effective weapon. Richard O'Kane, now commanding USS Tang, combined relentless discipline with extraordinary tactical creativity. Unlike many commanders who preferred firing from long range, O'Kane repeatedly closed to distances that left almost no margin for error. Every decision increased danger to his own boat, but it also dramatically increased the probability of a hit. His calculations were simple. A submarine that survived without sinking ships contributed little to winning the war. Tang soon became one of the most successful submarines ever commissioned by the United States Navy. Patrol after patrol, O'Kane demonstrated that initiative consistently defeated rigid doctrine. Rather than attacking from predictable directions, he approached convoys where escorts expected the least danger. Night became an ally rather than an obstacle. Surface attacks allowed higher speeds, better visibility, and faster repositioning between targets. Japanese escort commanders often realized they were under attack only after the first explosions shattered the formation. Other commanders reached similar conclusions independently. Eugene Lucky Flucky of USS Barb refused to think of submarines as passive ambush weapons. Under his command, Barb repeatedly entered heavily defended waters where Japanese commanders believed no American submarine would willingly operate. Flucky accepted extraordinary risks because he understood something many opponents did not. Surprise multiplied the value of every torpedo fired. Convoys protected by dozens of escorts became vulnerable if they never expected an attack in the first place. The culture spreading through the silent service encouraged controlled aggression rather than reckless behavior. Every patrol generated detailed reports describing successful attacks, failed approaches, escort tactics, weather conditions, and navigation techniques. Lessons moved rapidly from one submarine squadron to another. Young commanders entering combat inherited not only experience from instructors, but fresh knowledge written only days earlier by officers returning from the front. Continuous adaptation became part of everyday operations. Japan struggled to keep pace because its strategic assumptions remained largely unchanged. The Imperial Navy continued assigning valuable destroyers to protect major fleet units while merchant shipping received fewer escorts than the situation demanded. Even when convoy systems expanded, shortages of radar, sonar, trained escort crews, and fuel limited their effectiveness. The longer the war continued, the fewer resources remained available to defend the ships carrying the resources themselves. It became a vicious cycle with no easy escape. The numbers told a devastating story. Month after month, Japanese merchant tonnage disappeared beneath the Pacific faster than new ships could replace it. Tankers proved especially irreplaceable. Every tanker sunk represented fuel that would never reach aircraft factories, naval bases, or frontline fleets. Pilots received fewer training hours. Warships remained anchored because fuel had become too valuable to waste. Aircraft sat idle while mechanics waited for replacement parts trapped hundreds of miles away aboard ships that never reached port. American intelligence noticed another consequence. Japanese convoy routes became increasingly indirect as commanders attempted to avoid known submarine patrol areas. Longer voyages required more fuel, more escorts, and more time. Every adjustment designed to improve safety instead magnified logistical strain. Even convoys that survived often arrived late with damaged schedules and exhausted crews. Victory no longer depended solely on sinking ships, forcing Japan to spend more effort protecting every shipment achieved nearly the same effect. The submarine force itself paid a terrible price. American boats operated deep inside hostile waters where aircraft, destroyers, minefields, and mechanical failures posed constant threats. Hundreds of submariners never returned from patrol. Entire crews vanished without leaving final messages. Families waited months before learning that a boat was officially overdue, then presumed lost. Success came at extraordinary human cost, a reality often hidden behind impressive tonnage statistics. Yet the willingness of commanders to accept danger inspired remarkable confidence among their crews. Sailors knew when captains hesitated unnecessarily, and they knew when leaders accepted the same risks they demanded of everyone else. Officers like O'Kane and Flucky built trust through competence rather than speeches. They studied enemy habits obsessively, rehearsed emergency procedures repeatedly, and expected excellence during every watch. Aggression succeeded because it rested upon preparation, not impulse. Nimitz watched these developments with growing satisfaction. He had never intended simply to replace cautious officers with fearless ones. Fear alone accomplished nothing. What he sought were commanders capable of independent judgment under relentless pressure. Men willing to question outdated assumptions, exploit fleeting opportunities, and accept responsibility for decisions made hundreds of miles from headquarters. The Pacific was too vast for centralized control. Victory depended upon individuals acting correctly before orders could ever reach them. By early 1944, Japan's industrial economy had begun feeling the full weight of the campaign. Steel production slowed, oil reserves shrank, food shortages worsened across the home islands. Military planners increasingly discovered that divisions existed on paper but lacked the supplies needed for sustained combat. American carrier task forces, amphibious invasions, and strategic bombing campaigns would eventually dominate public memory of the Pacific War. None of them, however, operated in isolation. Every offensive benefited from an enemy already weakened by a submarine campaign that had systematically dismantled the empire's logistical foundation. The officers once dismissed as unsuitable for command had become precisely the leaders the war required. Their victories did not arrive through dramatic fleet battles visible to the world. They came one convoy at a time, one tanker at a time, one impossible decision after another. And with every successful patrol, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted further beneath the waves where Japan's greatest weakness had finally become impossible to hide. September 10th, 1945. As representatives of the Japanese Empire stepped aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay to sign the documents ending the Second World War, photographers focused on generals, admirals, and diplomats gathered on the battleship's deck. The ceremony symbolized the triumph of overwhelming American power. Yet one of the greatest victories of the Pacific War had taken place far below the surface, beyond the reach of cameras, where no audience had witnessed it. By the time Japan surrendered, its merchant fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war strength. The empire that once stretched across the Pacific could no longer feed its people, fuel its navy, or supply its armies. Long before the final signatures were placed on paper, defeat had already been written beneath the waves. American submarines accounted for less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel during the war. Despite that tiny share of manpower, they were responsible for sinking well over half of Japan's merchant shipping and a substantial portion of its naval combat fleet. Oil tankers vanished. Ammunition ships disappeared. Troop transports failed to reach distant islands. Every sinking forced impossible choices upon Japanese commanders already struggling with dwindling resources. Which island would receive fuel? Which airbase would remain operational? Which fleet could actually leave port? Eventually, there were no satisfactory answers. The collapse happened gradually. Then, all at once. Aircraft factories completed airplanes that could barely fly because aviation fuel had become critically scarce. Battleships that had once represented the pride of the Imperial Navy spent months anchored in harbor, preserved not by enemy fear, but by empty fuel tanks. Even experienced pilots entered combat with fewer training hours because precious gasoline could no longer be spared. Japan had not simply lost ships. It had lost the ability to sustain modern war. None of that outcome was inevitable in December 1941. The United States possessed submarines, but it did not yet possess the leadership culture capable of using them to their full potential. That transformation began when Chester W. Nimitz questioned assumptions others accepted without hesitation. Instead of protecting ineffective traditions, he protected effectiveness itself. Captains who repeatedly avoided decisive action quietly disappeared from frontline commands. Officers who demonstrated initiative, adaptability, and relentless determination received opportunities that might never have existed in peacetime. Richard O'Kane finished the war as America's highest-scoring submarine commander by confirmed tonnage. Eugene Fluckey earned the Medal of Honor after leading USS Barb through some of the boldest operations ever attempted by a submarine, including attacks inside heavily defended coastal waters and the only known ground raid conducted from an American submarine during the war. Many others achieved extraordinary success without becoming household names. Their stories rarely centered on dramatic speeches or public recognition. They centered on silent patrols, patient calculations, and moments when a single decision changed the fate of an entire convoy. The campaign also left painful reminders of its cost. 52 American submarines were lost during the war. More than 3,500 submariners never returned home. Some disappeared without survivors. Others fought until depth charges, flooding, or mechanical failure ended their final patrol. Every successful commander understood that statistics represented real crews occupying steel compartments no larger than railroad cars, living for months beneath constant pressure, mechanical noise, and the knowledge that one mistake could become irreversible within seconds. What made Nimitz's decisions remarkable was not simply that he chose aggressive officers. Military history is filled with bold commanders who achieved little because courage alone cannot compensate for poor judgment. Nimitz selected men who combined confidence with competence, independence with discipline, and initiative with continuous learning. They challenged doctrine when evidence demanded it, but never ignored preparation. Their willingness to adapt proved stronger than any single weapon the United States produced during the war. The lesson extended far beyond submarine warfare. Organizations often reward caution during peace because stability appears efficient. Promotions favor predictability. Procedures become habits. Success reinforces existing beliefs until questioning them feels unnecessary. War punishes that mindset without mercy. The institutions able to recognize failure, replace ineffective leadership, and learn faster than their opponents usually prevail, regardless of how the conflict begins. Nimitz understood that replacing commanders was not an admission of weakness. It was an investment in victory. Looking back, it is tempting to imagine that the Pacific War was decided by aircraft carriers at Midway, Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima, or battleships assembled in Tokyo Bay. Those moments deserve their place in history, but they tell only part of the story. Behind every invasion sailed convoys that reached their destinations. Behind every Japanese defeat stood factories producing less fuel, fewer weapons, and diminishing supplies because American submarines had already severed the empire's lifelines. The decisive battlefield often lay hundreds of miles away from the headlines. The burning harbors of Pearl Harbor had convinced many Americans that battleships would determine the future of the war. Chester Nimitz saw another possibility hidden beneath the surface. He trusted a force that many underestimated, questioned assumptions that others defended, and quietly placed extraordinary responsibility into the hands of officers who had not always fit the Navy's traditional image of command. Those decisions did not produce immediate headlines. They produced results. Convoy by convoy, tanker by tanker, patrol after patrol, they dismantled the logistical foundation of the Japanese Empire until victory became a matter of time rather than possibility. The submarines returned to port one by one, some scarred by depth charges, some carrying battle flags filled with rising sun silhouettes. Many never returned at all. But together they proved that wars are not always won by the largest fleets or the loudest victories. Sometimes they are won by the commanders willing to challenge convention before history forces everyone else to do the same. If this story stayed with you, consider leaving a like so more people can discover the overlooked decisions that shaped history. Subscribe if you want more deeply researched stories about the commanders, strategies, and turning points that changed the course of war. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.